She sold herself for $6 million. My sister Erin threw the line out like a punchline loud enough to cut through the early 2000s music and the clink of glasses in the Lakeside Hotel ballroom. And for a second, I honestly thought she had to be talking about someone else. Then I heard my own name, heard the soft little ripple of laughter that followed, and the plastic cup of water in my hand started to shake so hard I had to pinch it with both fingers to keep from spilling it. We were standing under a banner that said Duluth Central High Class of 2004 20-year reunion, surrounded by faces I had not seen in 2 decades, and the smell of buffet food and cheap champagne, and suddenly I did not feel like a 43-year-old woman who owned part of her life. I felt 17 again, the forgettable sister who never quite belonged. Erin was in the center of a little circle near the bar, one hand wrapped around a flute of sparkling wine, the other carving big, confident shapes in the air. "You should have seen Jenna," she told them, her voice bright and easy. "First marriage, some nice guy who fixed air conditioners. Second one, landlord with $6 million in properties. If that is not a glow-up, I do not know what is." The group gave that polite half-laugh people use when they are not sure if something is funny or just mean. And I stood 3 steps behind her, close enough to smell her perfume and far enough that no one had to pretend to bring me into the story. I told myself to breathe. I told myself I had survived worse than this nights of divorce papers and double shifts and tenants calling at 2 a.m. when pipes burst in January. I told myself I was not that girl anymore. But the words still landed like a slap because I had heard versions of them my whole life, just never this loud and never with this many witnesses. Erin tipped her head, letting her earrings catch the ballroom lights, and kept building her story. "She's always been like that," she said to our old classmates, people who used to sit next to us in algebra and gym. "Jenna never really knew what she wanted. Always anxious, always chasing some plan that did not work out. Then poof. She finds herself a guy with a portfolio." She snapped her fingers. "Our family's little investment gone right." The phrase went straight through me. Once if my family had called me an investment, I might have heard pride. Tonight it sounded like they had bought me and flipped me for a profit. I could have turned away. I could have pretended the music was too loud and I did not hear a thing. Instead, I stayed fixed to the patterned carpet and watched Erin slip deeper into the role she loved most, the charming storyteller who used my life as a prop. She put on a face of fake concern. "Bless her heart, though," she added, "she has always been a mess with money. Could never get ahead on her own, not really. But hey, she landed a $6 million contract, right?" A man I barely recognized from the yearbook let out a low whistle. "So how does it feel to wake up in $6 million?" he asked, and this time several heads turned eyes skimming the room, brushing over me before sliding away. I wanted to tell them the truth that most mornings it feels like waking up to emails about broken boilers, about tenants who lost their jobs, about roofs that need patching before snow comes. That security is not something you marry into. It is something you build in boring little decisions nobody ever posts on Facebook. Instead, I did what I have always done too well. I stayed quiet and let someone else narrate my life. Erin was only warming up. She set her glass down, pulled her phone out of her clutch, and started swiping with the speed of someone who has rehearsed this. "You have to see this," she said. "Facebook makes it look like she built it all. We all know better, right?" She tapped a few times and held the screen up for the nearest couple. Even from behind her, I knew exactly which picture she had chosen. Italy last year. I was on a small balcony in Florence in a navy dress city, lights spread out behind me like another sky. Dylan had taken that photo right after we signed papers on a tired strip mall outside Duluth, right after he kissed my forehead and told me no one read a building like I did. Erin zoomed in on my smile and the faint glimpse of the apartment behind me. "Look at this," she said. "Triplex by the lake vacations in Europe. She really hit the jackpot." Someone near her said, "Must be nice," under their breath. A woman I sort of remembered asked, "What does he do again?" And Erin laughed, delighted. "He collects rent checks. She manages to spend them." This time the laughter was easier, warmer, like the room had finally relaxed into the joke. Heat rose up my neck. I slipped my own phone out of my purse just to have something solid in my hand. The screen lit up my face. At the top of my inbox was a subject line I had already seen in the car and flicked away from on instinct. Board packet, North Shore, Community Credit Union Q4 meeting. I stared at it for a second. It was proof of a whole other version of my life. Thursday nights in a conference room reading loan files, voting on policies that would decide which families qualified for mortgages and which did not. Director Cole, the branch manager, called me when he introduced me to new staff. I swiped the email away again. Nobody here needed to know about that. To them, I was easier to understand as the girl who married up the girl who got lucky, the little sister who rode someone else's wave. Let them think it, I told myself. It is easier than trying to explain how many years it took to learn how buildings breathe and where the money leaks out. Erin lifted her glass once more, like a prop on a stage she believed was hers. To my baby sister, she called out loud enough that the DJ glanced over his laptop, who finally figured out that if you cannot make money, you might as well marry it. The laugh that followed rolled across the room in one bright wave. I saw a few faces tighten, saw one classmate look down at their shoes, but nobody stepped in. It was just a joke, just sisters. Just family. My fingers dug into the thin plastic rim of the cup until it bowed in the cold water, sloshing close to the edge. The old mix rose in my chest, shame and anger twisted so tight together, I could not tell which one was choking me more. Part of me wanted to walk straight into that circle, take the phone out of Erin's hand and tell every person there exactly how many times I had emptied my own accounts to drag our parents back from the edge when the county threatened their house for back taxes. Another part of me wanted to disappear to slip out the side door drive home to the quiet of our kitchen and pretend I had never thought tonight could be about healing. I shifted my weight, half turning to leave, and that was when the air around us changed. It started small, just a shift in the direction of people's eyes. The little circle around Erin stopped looking at her phone and started looking past her shoulder. Conversations at nearby tables thinned out and then stalled like someone had reached for a dial and turned the room down. Erin did not notice. She was busy lining up one more blow. Honestly, she said, flicking her hand without him, she would still be managing those old duplexes on the wrong side of town. She should send me flowers for pushing her to come tonight. At least we got a good story out of it. I watched the back of her perfect hair, the way her shoulders squared like she owned the place, and then my gaze moved past her. He was standing just a few feet behind her, hands in his pockets, the ballroom lights catching in his whiskey-colored eyes, and in that instant I knew, with a sinking, then sharply rising certainty, that my husband had heard every single word. When Erin's voice was still echoing in my head at the reunion and that sick heat was still crawling up my spine, it pulled me backward in time, with the kind of force only childhood memories can carry, and suddenly I was standing again in our old house on Maple Ridge Road in Duluth in the late 90s, where the winters felt endless and the walls always seemed to hold more silence for me than for anyone else, and where every pattern of our family life could be traced back to one unspoken rule that shaped everything I became, Erin first and the rest of us later. I remember the house as a place that smelled of paper mill smoke from Dad's clothes and the sugary scent of Target bakery cookies Mom sometimes brought home when they were discounted at the end of her shift, and I remember Erin floating through that house like a lit candle, bright and warm and impossible not to look at, while I drifted behind her like smoke that never thickened enough to matter. Dad worked rotating shifts at the paper plant, which meant he either came home exhausted with pulp dust in his hair or left before the sun was up, and Mom spent her days scanning items and smiling at strangers who appreciated her more than her own daughters did, and Erin was their pride. The cheerleader with the high ponytail and straight teeth and honor roll certificates taped to the fridge, and I was the younger one who preferred drawing floor plans on scrap paper and flipping through real estate catalogs like they were fairy tale books, imagining lives built room by room, even though no one thought of that as a real dream. The first time I understood how deeply Aaron first ran in our family was the day Dad sat us at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of instant hot chocolate and explained the college fund he and Mom had scraped together over years of tax returns and skipped vacations and long overtime shifts. And he said it was small, but enough to help both of us get started, and I believed him because I wanted to, and because he said both in that steady voice of his. But a year later, when Erin announced she was enrolling in Lake Superior Community College, I heard Dad tell Mom in the living room that they would use the fund for Erin first and Jenna can figure things out later. She is steady. She is fine. Erin has potential. A line that lodged somewhere under my ribs and stayed there for decades. I did not ask questions, not then because I had been raised to be grateful for whatever crumbs fell my way. But months later, when I overheard Mom telling Aunt Linda on the phone that every penny of the fund had gone to Erin's tuition and books and parking permit, and that Erin deserved it because she was going somewhere, I felt something tilt in my chest, and for the first time I saw clearly that figuring things out later meant never being considered in the first place. And no one ever talked about replacing the money or saving again or helping me when my time came. They simply moved on because Erin first was the natural order of things. The second injustice came wrapped in something even smaller, and because of that, it stung more in a painfully ordinary way. I had been delivering newspapers on weekends since I was 14, riding my bike through sleet and slush, and saving every tip in a small metal lockbox under my bed until the total reached $800, a fortune to me. And I had planned to buy a used laptop for school so I would not have to share Erin's old one with the cracked hinge. But then Erin said she needed money to repair her car so she could get to her classes, and she promised it was only temporary and that she would pay me back as soon as she could, and I handed over the envelope because in our family, Erin's needs were emergencies while mine were luxuries. 6 months later, when I asked for the money, she laughed like I had told a joke and said, "You are so dramatic." We are family, and Mom, who was folding laundry beside her, added, "You cannot nickel and dime your own sister Jenna let it go. She needs it more than you ever did," and I felt foolish for even asking, and even more foolish for believing the word temporary, because in our house, temporary simply meant until Erin no longer wanted or needed it, and it was unbelievable how fast $800 could vanish when nobody thought it belonged to you in the first place. The third injustice was smaller still but sharper, the kind that builds resentment in quiet girls like me. Clothes always flowed Erin's way. First, every new jacket, every pair of decent jeans, and I inherited the pieces she no longer liked or that no longer fit, which meant most of my closet was Erin's past, while hers was lined with her future. And when I won a small award in 10th grade for a drawing of a neighborhood layout, something I had poured hours into, Mom brought the certificate home and placed it on the counter. But when relatives came over that weekend, she used the visit to tell them Erin had just been chosen as captain of the cheer team, and my award stayed under a stack of coupons because Erin's moments were announcements and mine were footnotes. I learned not to expect applause, and I learned not to ask for fairness, because fairness was something that lived in other families and not ours. The final twist of that era came quietly on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in spring, when the snow was melting into gray slush outside, and Mom was at work, and I was looking for aluminum foil in the kitchen drawer. And instead I found an envelope already opened with my name printed across the front in the clean block letters of an organization I did not recognize. And inside was a letter congratulating me on being selected for a community architecture scholarship, one that covered materials and classes and part-time mentorship. And my throat tightened as I read it because it was the first time anyone besides me had seen something in my interest in houses and floor plans, something real, something worth nurturing, and as I held the paper, my hands shaking with the possibility of a different future. Mom walked in through the back door earlier than usual, and when she saw the letter in my hand, her face tightened, and she said, "I did not want you getting distracted. I do not want you going far. You are needed here. There is plenty to do, and those programs do not lead anywhere anyway. Jenna, you are steady. You will be fine." And that was the moment something in me cracked, because it was the first betrayal that came not from Aaron's entitlement, but from my mother's fear dressed up as love. And even though I did not have the courage then to fight it, a seed began to grow, the realization that no one was ever going to choose me in this family, not unless I chose myself first, and that silent truth became the backbone of every decision I made after that, even long before I had the power to act on it. When I look back at the years that followed that scholarship letter incident, I can see now how smoothly I slid from one pattern of being used to another, as if my childhood had trained me for it without my knowing. And by the time I turned 25 and married Tom Walker, a kind man on the surface with calloused hands from repairing air conditioners and a gentle smile that never quite hid his lack of ambition, I thought I was choosing stability, but in truth, I was choosing the familiar weight of carrying more than my share and pretending it was love, because love was the only language I had ever been taught to translate into sacrifice. We lived in a ground-floor duplex that smelled faintly of mildew in summer and cold plaster in winter, the wallpaper peeling at the corners and the carpet holding the ghosts of tenants before us, and I convinced myself it was temporary, that it was a place we would laugh about one day once we worked hard enough and climbed out. But I did not know then how heavy climbing alone can feel when the other person only watches you strain. I worked as an assistant at a small property management office in town, answering tenant calls about leaking faucets and writing maintenance work orders while studying every lease contract I touched, and memorizing which expenses were tax deductible and which buildings were bleeding money, and I began to love the logic of it in a way that felt like oxygen, but I also began to feel the first hints of tension, because Tom never understood why I brought work home, or why I was excited by spreadsheets and rent rolls, and he would tell me, "You do too much." Jenna breathed for a second, yet he never realized that working hard was the only way I knew to create a life that felt like my own. Meanwhile, my parents fell behind on their property taxes again, and when a letter came, warning of a possible tax lien, Mom called me, at work, with that tremble in her voice that always made me feel responsible. And Dad said he was picking up extra shifts, but it would not be enough in time. And before I even thought about it, I pulled money from my tiny 401k and accepted the penalty and told myself it was my duty, because Aaron had kids, and Aaron was stressed, and Aaron should not have to carry everything. And Mom even said it out loud, "Aaron has kids. Jenna, you do not. It is different." And I swallowed the sting, because that sentence had been carved into me since childhood. Tom watched me write the check and tried to hide his frustration, but it leaked out anyway when he said I thought we were saving for a down payment, and I said we are, but my parents need this. And he said gently but firmly, "You cannot keep fixing everything and everyone." But I ignored him and told myself he did not understand family the way I did. Weeks later at a family barbecue, I overheard Aaron telling a group of cousins, if it was not for Tom, Jenna would still be paying rent forever. He is the real man in that relationship, and the words hit me like a slap. Not only because they were untrue, but because Aaron knew exactly what she was doing. She was placing Tom on a pedestal, so that my own hard work disappeared under his shadow. And the irony was suffocating, because the only reason our finances were stable at all was because I had spent nights calculating budgets and juggling bills and making sure we did not fall behind while also propping up my parents. And I watched Tom's face when he heard Aaron's comment and saw the confusion there, as if he had stepped into a story he did not recognize, and his silence settled into both of us like dust. As the years went on, the cracks in our marriage widened in ways small enough to ignore, until they were not small at all, and the main fracture line always came back to the same theme. I kept pouring time and money into my parents' problems, and Tom kept feeling like our own future was being stolen piece by piece, and our arguments were always the same. "We cannot save everyone, Jenna," he would say, and I would say, "They are my family. What do you expect me to do?" And he would say, "I expect you to choose us for once." And I would feel guilt bloom so fast it burned, because choosing him meant abandoning the people who had built their entire lives around the assumption that I would always be the fixer, the helper, the steady one. I lived in a cycle of guilt where if I helped my parents, Tom looked at me like I had betrayed our marriage, and if I refused to help my parents, I imagined my mother's disappointment and Aaron's judgment and my father's quiet exhaustion, and so I helped and apologized and then helped again and apologized again until my apologies felt like wallpaper covering a cracked wall. The final twist of that marriage came on a weekday evening in late autumn, when the wind was rattling the loose window frames of our duplex, and the sun was setting early behind the row of tired houses across the street, and I walked in, carrying groceries, and feeling unusually hopeful because I thought maybe tonight we could sit and talk calmly. Maybe tonight he would understand how much I was trying to balance. But the apartment was strangely quiet, and the closet door was open and half empty, and the drawers were pulled out and bare, and on the kitchen table sat a crisp envelope with my name on it beside the divorce papers, and a short handwritten note that read, "You already have a family. I was just the wallet you used to pay their bills." I stood there staring at the words while something inside me caved in, not because the note was cruel, but because it was honest, in a way I had been too afraid to examine, and the shock came not only from losing a marriage I had fought to hold together, but from realizing that the man I thought would be my partner had watched me drown under the weight of everyone else's needs, and instead of reaching for my hand, he had stepped out of the water and left me standing there alone. It was the first time I truly saw the pattern of my life, the way every role I filled was shaped by what others needed from me, and how little space I had ever made for what I needed for myself. And standing in that empty apartment with the echo of Tom's words filling the room, I finally understood that I had become the same thing in my marriage that I had been in my family, a silent bank account, with a heartbeat, a person whose value was measured only by what she could give, and that realization marked the first quiet spark of the transformation that would come later, though in that moment, I only felt the hollow ache of being left behind once again. After the divorce, I moved into a small studio on the east side of Duluth, the kind with thin walls and a single window that looked out at a parking lot where the streetlights buzzed at night, and the rent was cheap enough that I could breathe without calculating which bill I would have to skip. And I spent my evenings learning every corner of Excel and every line of a cash flow statement, because numbers were the only place where things behaved the way they were supposed to. They added up when you asked them to, and they made sense, even when nothing else in my life did. I told myself that I was fine, that being alone was better than being half-loved. But some nights, the silence of that studio felt like a second skin, and I wished for just one moment where someone would look at me and see more than a convenient source of help or a quiet shoulder to lean on. When Thanksgiving of 2015 came around, my mother called 3 times in 1 week, asking if I would come home for dinner, saying, "Your father misses you, and the house feels empty without you." And I hesitated, because holidays have a way of exposing every old wound. But in the end, I went, because my father had never been part of the unfairness, and I still loved him. In that uncomplicated way daughters love the parent who has never asked too much of them. The Cole house looked the same as it always had. The brown siding, a little faded, the porch, a little uneven, the kitchen, warm with the smell of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes. And when I walked in, Erin was already there, dressed in something sparkly, even though it was just family, and she wrapped her arms around me with that airy voice she used whenever she wanted to show She was above everyone else saying, "Look at you, Jenna, single and glowing or trying to glow anyway." And I forced a smile because starting a fight in front of the children felt pointless. Dinner was crowded with my parents, Erin, her husband Mark, their 2 kids, and a couple of aunts and uncles, who had always believed Erin's version of any story long before mine. And at first, the talk was light, but slowly, as always, it drifted toward me like a tide that kept pulling me into the same shallow water. And one aunt asked, "How does it feel being single again?" And another said, "Are you still just managing other people's buildings?" And their voices had that polite sharpness that is somehow worse than open mockery, and I felt the old, familiar tightness in my chest. Erin was cutting her turkey with exaggerated movements like a performer on stage, and she suddenly chimed in with a laugh that sounded rehearsed, saying, "Oh, you should have seen Jenna last year. She cried because her credit score dropped after she helped Mom and Dad pay their taxes, and everyone turned to look at me as if expecting confirmation, and I just kept my eyes on my plate because confirming it would not earn me any sympathy, and denying it would only make Erin push harder." She kept going, describing how I had talked for years about wanting to invest in real estate, yet still could not even buy a tiny condo on my own, and she said it in the tone people use for funny anecdotes, but it was a knife wrapped in sugar, and the table chuckled. Even my mother gave a small smile, the kind meant to ease tension, but instead, it pressed deeper into me. Then came the moment that still stings when I replay it in my head. Erin stood to refill her glass, and as she came around my chair, she gave a little dramatic stumble, and the red wine splashed across the front of my blouse, dark and warm and shocking. And she gasped with childish delight, saying, "Oops, guess. Even the wine wants you to loosen up," and everyone laughed except me and my father, who reached for napkins, while my mother fussed over the tablecloth instead of me. I whispered, "It is fine. I will clean it," and went to the small hallway bathroom where the yellow bulb flickered, and I tried to dab the stain out of the fabric, but it only spread wider, like a bruise. And when I looked up at the mirror, I saw myself standing there alone in a house I grew up in, yet feeling like I did not belong to it anymore. And my throat tightened because this was not new, and that was the part that hurt the most. I remembered every time Erin had taken something small that mattered to me and turned it into a joke every time my mother had excused it with "she does not mean anything by it." And every time I had tried to convince myself that being quiet was easier than being honest. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the muffled laughter from the dining room and feeling the weight of years pressing on my shoulders, and for the first time I wondered not why they treated me the way they did, but why I kept coming back. When I returned to the table, nobody mentioned the wine incident. They had moved on to dessert discussions, and Erin was talking about Black Friday deals with the excitement of someone who thrived on spending money she did not earn, and I sat down quietly finishing the meal in silence, because arguing would only drag the night deeper into the kind of humiliation I had carried since childhood. After dinner, I helped clear dishes while Erin showed my mother pictures of her renovated kitchen, and when I said goodnight, she hugged me too tightly and whispered, "You should try smiling more. It might help you meet someone." And I stepped out into the cold air, feeling that wind cut across my damp blouse, and I walked to my car with the kind of sadness that sinks all the way into your bones. Later that night, back in my studio, I opened my laptop intending to lose myself in work and saw an email notification from my boss with the subject line "expansion opportunity." And when I clicked it, I had to read it twice because the company was planning to open a larger office in Minneapolis, and they wanted someone experienced, disciplined, and strong with tenant relations to lead a new property team. And he wrote, "Jenna, you are the first person we thought of. Would you consider relocating?" I sat there in that dim little apartment and felt something shift inside me, a quiet, almost imperceptible click, like a lock turning, because for the first time a door was opening that had nothing to do with my family's needs or Erin's shadow or the version of myself they had always preferred, and everything to do with who I might become if I let myself leave the place where I had spent my whole life being diminished. It was the first real escape route I had ever been offered, and as I reread the email, my stained blouse still clinging cold against my skin, I felt a faint pulse of hope that maybe I did not have to keep playing the role they had written for me, and maybe this time I could choose something different, something that belonged only to me. Leaving Duluth felt like stepping out of a shadow I had lived in for years, and when the moving truck pulled away from my parents' driveway after Thanksgiving, I drove south toward Minneapolis, with everything I owned packed into the back seat and a quiet mix of fear and relief sitting in my chest, because I knew I was not just changing cities, I was changing the entire way my life had been shaped by obligation and guilt. And as the highway opened up in front of me, I felt that same faint pulse of hope from the night I read the email stronger now, almost like a heartbeat. The apartment the company arranged for me was small but clean, with wide windows that let in clear northern light. And after the cramped studio in Duluth, it felt almost luxurious to have a separate bedroom and a kitchen big enough for more than one person to stand in. And though it was modest, it was mine. And it represented a kind of independence I had not tasted since before my marriage. Work began immediately, and my days filled with tenant calls, contractor scheduling maintenance orders, and budget approvals. And at first, the volume of issues overwhelmed me, because managing 90 units meant juggling leaky faucets, broken heaters, eviction notices, and the constant tension between owners who wanted to save money and tenants who wanted immediate repairs. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized I was good at this. Not just adequate, but genuinely strong at reading a building the way some people read a face, noticing things most others overlooked, like the pattern of repeated water damage on the second floor that signaled a structural issue, or the way a poorly managed parking lot could quietly cost thousands a year in towing disputes. And once I began to understand these patterns, the work became less chaotic and more like a language I was finally fluent in. After work a few evenings each week, I drove to a community college about 20 minutes away, where I took a real estate finance class, using my own paycheck to cover tuition, because I knew if I wanted to get out of the cycle my family had held me in, I needed to learn the rules of money from the inside. And those nights were exhausting but oddly empowering, because as I sat in that fluorescent lit classroom among people 10 or 20 years younger than me, I began piecing together formulas for cap rates, debt ratios, and return projections, and slowly realizing that the world of property ownership was not some unreachable place reserved only for people like Aaron believed, but a structure anyone could climb if they understood how to interpret the math. One afternoon, not long after I finished the first half of the course, my boss called me into his office with a stack of financial reports and asked what I thought of a small 10-unit building the company was considering selling. And without hesitating, I told him the numbers were bad only because the previous manager had let deferred maintenance pile up, and that the building still had strong long-term potential if someone invested in it properly. And he nodded slowly, watching me with a kind of curiosity, before saying, "You really see these properties for what they could be, not just what they look like now." And he told me the owners were willing to let employees buy small equity shares at a steep discount if they believed in the building. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table running numbers over and over until I could see that even though the investment was tiny on paper, it was the first chance I had ever been given to shift from managing someone else's asset to owning a sliver of it myself. And it terrified me because committing nearly all my savings meant losing every safety net I had. But it also thrilled me because for once the risk was tied to my future, not someone else's crisis. And the next morning, with my hands shaking slightly, I signed the paperwork and became a 1% owner in a real building that stood 3 blocks away from the river. Becoming a part owner changed how I walked into work because suddenly every improvement mattered in a new way, and I found myself paying closer attention to potential investment opportunities, as if a door in my mind had opened. And that was around the time I first met Dylan Ward when he walked into a meeting with my boss to discuss hiring our company to manage his duplexes and triplexes around Minneapolis. He was tall, with sleeves rolled up forearms, darkened from years of working on his own properties, and he spoke plainly in a way that made him seem both grounded and direct, and I noticed how he listened when I broke down the cash flow projections for his buildings, without using flashy terms or over-promising results, and when the meeting ended, he looked at me and said, "You talk in numbers, not fluff. I respect that." Within weeks, I became the primary manager for all his units, handling repairs, screening tenants, and restructuring maintenance schedules. And little by little, his cash flow improved because he listened to every recommendation I made and acted on them quickly. And I realized that working with him felt different from working with most owners because he treated me like a partner, not hired help, and he paid attention without undercutting or second-guessing me. As we collaborated, more often, conversations between us shifted from property issues to quiet personal moments, small comments about growing up in working-class families or shouldering more than people realized, and on some level, I felt seen in a way I had not since I was a teenager, before Aaron's shadow swallowed everything. Then one afternoon after we toured a building together, he leaned against his truck and told me with that straightforward tone of his, "You know this business better than half the guys I sit across from at the bank. Why are you not on any boards?" And I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he looked at me seriously, as if he saw something in me I had not yet allowed myself to believe existed. And that question lingered in my mind long after the conversation ended. 3 months later, on a snowy morning in early February, I opened my mailbox and found a formal envelope addressed to me from the North Shore Community Credit Union, the institution that handled mortgages and small business loans for most of the Duluth and North Shore region, and when I tore it open inside, was an invitation to join their board of directors as a new member selected for my understanding of property management, financial planning, and community housing needs. And I sat down on the edge of my couch, stunned because people like me girls who grew up wearing hand-me-down clothes and saving newspaper delivery money were not the kind of people invited to sit on boards that affected entire communities. I accepted the position without hesitation, but I told no one in my family because I knew exactly what Aaron would turn it into. Either ammunition or envy, and both outcomes made my stomach churn, so I kept the title and responsibilities tucked quietly into my private world, a powerful secret that no one in Duluth, except a handful of professionals, knew about. And it became the first piece of my life that existed completely outside of my family's reach. Falling in love with Dylan did not happen in a rush the way movies pretend love works. Instead, it settled into my life slowly and steadily, like a roof repaired one tile at a time, until one day I realized the leaks that used to soak through everything had quietly stopped, and the man who once arrived to our meetings with a tool belt in his truck and a thermos of coffee had become the person whose messages I looked for first each morning, and whose voice steadied me after long days dealing with repairs and budgets and tenants who were always on the brink of something. We spent nearly 3 years building a rhythm that felt honest and grown, sharing weekends, walking through potential investment properties, and evenings cooking simple meals and talking about the future in the kind of quiet, unpretentious way that made it easy to imagine spending decades together. And when he proposed in early 2021, it was not with a grand gesture, but with a small velvet box held between calloused fingers, while we stood in the kitchen of one of his duplexes, surrounded by unpainted drywall and the smell of primer, because he said our life would always involve rebuilding something, and he wanted to rebuild everything beside me. A few months after the wedding, we sat at the dining table of our triplex and went over our combined finances, not to brag or inflate numbers, but to understand what we were responsible for and what we were capable of achieving. And that was when we realized that with his properties, his cash reserves, my 401k, my small equity stakes, and some recent appreciation across the market, our combined net worth was nearing $6 million, a number that felt surreal, and yet did not change the fact that we still packed our lunches, drove used cars, and lived in one unit of the triplex while renting the other two to tenants we knew by name. We chose that life intentionally because neither of us cared about showing off wealth and because both of us came from families where money was either scarce or weaponized, and we wanted our home to feel grounded and safe. But families have a way of twisting even the simplest truths, and when my mother first learned about Dylan's portfolio, she made a tight little smile and said, "You finally did something right, Jenna," as if my entire adulthood had been a string of mistakes leading up to one lucky catch. And when Erin heard the number, she did not even blink before calling it your $6 million marriage, as though none of the work behind those properties mattered, as though Dylan woke up one morning with the houses magically built, and as though I had contributed nothing but a signature. She said it often enough that the phrase began to float around the family group chat, and when her friends asked about me, she introduced Dylan and me as the 6 million couple, laughing as if it were a harmless joke. But the venom was always aimed at me, not him, because in her eyes I had skipped some moral line by finding someone successful. The first real crack came a year into our marriage when Erin called me one morning, speaking in that sugary tone she used when she wanted something and asked if I could lend her money to remodel her kitchen, because she said it would be an investment in the home, and she would pay me back once her husband's bonus came through. And I took a breath before answering, because old habits nearly pushed me into saying yes, but I had learned too much about boundaries and consequences to fall into that pattern again, and I told her gently but firmly that Dylan and I were tied up in a renovation and could not spare the money. There was a long pause before she clicked her tongue and muttered to our mother loud enough for me to hear, "See, she changed. Now it is all my investments, my portfolio." And I felt the sting of her words, but also the quiet relief of realizing I had not caved. What Erin never learned, at least not then, was that Dylan and I had just purchased a small, rundown strip mall near the edge of Duluth, a neglected property with peeling, paint-cracked pavement and 3 vacant units. But something in the structure told me it had potential, and when one of Dylan's partners invited us to join the deal, I saw the numbers add up in a way that whispered future stability. We put in a modest share, which made me a minority partner, but the ownership papers still carried my name, and I attended every meeting, listened to every contractor bid, and insisted on reviewing every repair proposal, because owning even a small slice of commercial property felt like holding a key to a door I never believed would open for someone like me. What made the situation almost darkly humorous was that one of the occupied units in the strip mall, the only one still paying a steady rent, happened to be a small nail salon, the same one Erin visited regularly and posted about online when she wanted to show off her self-care days with captions like, "Treating myself because I deserve it." And little did she know the rent from her pampered afternoons was contributing to a property where my decisions shaped the future. I never used that information against her. Never hinted at it, never flexed the power it gave me because revenge was not the point. Not yet, it was simply a quiet truth resting under the surface like a stone, waiting for the right moment to shift. But the knowledge itself felt like the first time in my life, when I was standing on solid financial ground, not because I had saved someone else, not because I had rescued my parents or covered Erin's mess, but because I had built something for myself with someone who saw my worth long before anyone else did. Dylan and I kept the strip mall purchase private, not out of secrecy, but out of peace. And when we sat on our porch in the evenings, watching the sun drop behind Lake Superior, we talked about future projects, about maybe expanding into the North Shore region or buying another small building to renovate and lease out. And every time I felt the same quiet gratitude for the life we were building, the one no one in my family understood, because they were too busy analyzing the number 6 million to realize most of the value rested not in the money, but in the autonomy and partnership behind it. And though Erin continued to mock, calling it the 6 million marriage, as though I had married into a lottery ticket instead of a partnership built on hard work, I stopped flinching at the phrase, because I knew the truth. And the truth was, this life was not a gift from someone else. It was the result of years of sweat calculations, late-night study sessions, and a determination to never again lose myself in the chaos of other people's expectations. The summer of 2024 arrived with that heavy northern heat that clings to your skin even before noon, and I was sorting through renovation invoices at the dining table when the envelope for the 20th year reunion showed up in our mailbox, a glossy navy invitation with silver lettering announcing Duluth Central High Class of 2004 reunion, and for a moment, I simply stared at it. Because reunions have a way of shaking loose memories you thought you had buried under years of work and distance, yet there was also a strange pull inside me, a curiosity about who I had become compared to the girl I once was, and whether I could finally face that room without shrinking. Dylan encouraged me to go, saying, "You spent years surviving those people. Maybe now you get to show them who you are," and I laughed because he made it sound simple when it was anything but. But I tucked the invitation on the counter, determined to make a decision after thinking about it. I did not have long to think because around the same time the reunion committee revived the Class of 2004 Facebook group, and within days it turned into a noisy thread of updates, old photos, and people announcing whether they would attend. And of course, Erin was in the group because she had been in my class, even though she was only a year older, and she jumped in immediately as if she had been waiting for this stage to open. The first comment I saw from her was, "Cannot wait for you guys to meet my baby sister and her $6 million husband," and the words sat on the screen like a smirk I could hear in her voice. And beneath it, several people responded with laughing emojis or little wow faces, and I felt my stomach tighten, not because of the money reference, but because she always chose the angle that made me look like something she owned or mocked. 2 days later, she posted an old yearbook photo of me with frizzy hair wearing a red Target shirt I used to pick up from the clearance rack when I could barely afford anything else, and she captioned it, "Glow up, huh?" as though the entire trajectory of my adult life was nothing more than a makeover montage, and people who barely knew me gushed in the comments, with half-mocking nostalgia while Erin fed every thread with winks and stories that made her the charming narrator of my past. I tried scrolling past it, telling myself it was silly to care what a group of people from 20 years ago thought, but viral humiliation takes on a life of its own, and each notification felt like someone tapping on my shoulder to remind me that no matter how far I had come, there were always corners of my history where Erin's voice rang louder than mine. The real blow came a week later when I logged in and saw Erin had made a new post in the group, written with her usual sugary tone that masked the bite underneath, asking any of you ever marry someone who turned your bank account from less than $50 to almost $6 million overnight. Asking for my sister, and beneath it the thread erupted with emojis, jokes, speculation, and comments that spun a narrative of me sliding into wealth through marriage. A narrative that erased every dollar I had saved, every loan I had studied, every building I had walked through with a flashlight at night. I sat there frozen for a few seconds, feeling a wave of heat and shame crawl up my neck, then closed the app entirely because I knew if I stayed online I would either cry or fire back, and neither reaction would make me feel any better. For a few weeks I refused to open Facebook at all, telling myself that peace meant choosing what I allowed into my mind. But Erin's voice lingered like a buzzing fly, even in the silence. And one evening, after a long day of reviewing bids for pavement repairs at the strip mall, I found myself thinking about how many years I had carried the weight of her narrative, how many times she had pushed the same story while I stayed quiet and accommodating. And that was when I remembered something almost absurd, something so mundane and so deeply rooted in the past that I laughed out loud because, for all the talk of $6 million, Erin, her husband Mark, and my mother were all still using the same family phone plan I had opened back when I was 22 and working part-time a plan that I had kept paying for every month on autopay, simply because no one ever offered to switch, and I kept telling myself it was not worth the hassle to change. It hit me that the woman bragging online about my life had not paid a phone bill in almost 2 decades, and on a petty, impulsive late-night surge, I opened my Verizon account, switched every line except mine to prepaid termination, scheduled the change for the end of the billing cycle, and sent a simple message in our family group text saying, "I am simplifying my finances. Please set up your own plan before the cycle ends." Less than 3 minutes later, my phone lit up with Erin calling, her voice sharp and high-pitched, the moment I picked up, asking, "Are you serious, Jenna? This is ridiculous. How am I supposed to deal with this right now?" And I felt a strange calm wash over me as I replied, "I am sure your nearly promoted husband can handle a Verizon bill," and the silence that followed was almost delicious. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I exhaled a long breath, realizing that this tiny action, this everyday act of reclaiming something I had been giving away out of habit, was the first real line I had drawn in years, a miniature form of justice that every woman who had ever been taken for granted would understand instantly. The fallout was immediate, frantic texts from my mother asking why I was causing trouble, defensive messages from Erin insisting I was overreacting, and then eventually quiet because there was nothing they could do except set up their own accounts like adults. And though it was a small victory, it felt like peeling back one layer of a long, entangled knot. A few days later, when I finally reopened Facebook, I discovered something unexpected buried deep in a thread I had not seen, because I had been offline a comment from Heather, one of the few classmates who had been kind to me back then, saying, "Last I checked, Jenna worked her butt off in real estate. Maybe do not assume you know where her money comes from," and beneath it a handful of likes from people who had been silent until then, people who clearly saw through Erin's performance. It was not a full defense or a sweeping reversal of the narrative, but it was a flicker of recognition, a faint reminder that not everyone accepted Erin's stories without question, and that tiny bit of truth lingering in the conversation felt like a small light in a long hallway, a sign that maybe the reunion would not be as impossible as I feared. The evening of the reunion arrived with a strange mixture of tension and resignation swirling in my chest as I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the simple navy dress I had chosen because I wanted to look put together, but not flashy confident, but not like someone trying to prove a point. And Dylan came up behind me, resting his hand lightly on my shoulder, saying he would try his best to make it there after finishing a walkthrough at one of the buildings. And I told him it was fine because I had spent most of my life walking into rooms alone and surviving them, though a small part of me wished he could have come from the start. I drove to the Lakeside Hotel where the reunion was being held, and the moment I stepped inside the ballroom, the familiar swirl of chatter music from the early 2000s and the scent of catered food washed over me. And for a moment, I almost felt like I was 17 again, standing on the edge of a room where I never quite fit, except this time I also carried years of work and quiet resilience that held me a little steadier. The room was decorated with a long buffet table, lined with silver trays, a photo booth draped in shimmering gold foil, and a large projector, playing a slideshow of our yearbook photos set to nostalgic pop songs. And as I moved through the crowd, I spotted Heather waving at me with a warm smile that eased some of the tightness in my chest. She hugged me and said, "I am glad you came," and introduced me to Mike, and a few others who asked how I had been and what I was doing now, and when I answered simply, "I work in property management," without mentioning the board or the investments or the net worth. None of them pressed further. Instead, they nodded respectfully and treated me like someone who had earned their place without needing to justify it. And that small kindness felt like a stitch, pulling closed an old wound. For the first 20 minutes, I let myself relax, drifting between conversations and nibbling at the buffet, while laughing politely at jokes that were harmless and ordinary, until the energy of the room shifted the moment Erin arrived, as if an invisible spotlight had suddenly swung in her direction, and she swept in wearing a sequined dress that shimmered under the ballroom lights, with hair styled in big waves, and a confidence so performative it could have passed for a parade float. She began greeting people loudly, hugging them with theatrical excitement, lingering just long enough to make sure she had drawn every eye in the room. And within moments, she was circling toward me with a drink already in her hand, even though the night had barely begun. She wrapped one arm around my shoulders in a gesture that was too tight to feel affectionate and too public to dismiss quietly, and announced, "You made it look everyone my baby sister," showed up before turning to the nearest group and launching immediately into a story about my divorce, calling it what happens when someone cannot handle living simple, and making it sound like I had failed at marriage because I was spoiled or unrealistic, as though she had not spent years watching me carry the weight of our parents' finances while she contributed nothing. She added now she has landed a man whose net worth has more zeros than my entire neighborhood, and the group erupted into polite laughter that made my skin prickle, because none of them knew where the line between humor and cruelty truly lay when Erin was the one speaking. The more she drank, the louder she became, pulling 2 or 3 of our former classmates into a tight semicircle around me, like she was assembling an audience, and each new comment sharpened her role as the star storyteller of my life, painting me as a charity case who stumbled into fortune rather than someone who had built a career piece by piece. My pulse quickened, and I tried to step away, but she caught my wrist lightly and said, No, stay, this part is great," before turning back to her listeners with a grin that was starting to slip into something sloppier. Then the MC called for anyone who wanted to share funny memories from high school, and before he even finished the sentence, Erin seized the microphone with an eagerness that made a few people snicker under their breath. And she launched into a story from junior year about how I once tried to apply for a credit card at Target, only to be declined at the register in front of a line of people because I was shaking and embarrassed and too stubborn to admit I had no credit history. And she said it with a flourish that made the room give an uncomfortable laugh before she added, "Now she probably buys Target," which made the awkwardness deepen into something sharper. I felt my cheeks burn. Not from shame, but from the dawning realization that Erin had been waiting for this night for months, collecting stories, rehearsing her lines, planning every jab like a comedian who had only one subject to joke about. I stood there frozen as the room grew quieter around the edges, people unsure whether to laugh or to look away, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as she kept going because Erin never knew when to stop. Then she lifted her phone with exaggerated glee and said, Wait, let me show you this." And before I could react, she airdropped a set of photos to the reunion coordinator, who assumed she was adding to the slideshow. And suddenly, on the small side screen near the photo booth, images of my house, my triplex, my vacations with Dylan in Europe flickered into view, all pulled from posts she had screenshotted and saved over time. And the caption she had typed in bold text sat at the bottom of the photos, reading "From Duplex Disaster to $6 Million Princess." A wave of heat crashed through me like someone had opened a furnace, and my hands started trembling because this was no longer teasing or sibling rivalry. This was humiliation stitched together with intention and performed for an entire room, and I felt something inside me crack open. I tried to steady my breath as she kept talking, oblivious to the shift in the crowd, bragging about knowing all my secrets and nudging people as if they should be impressed by her insider access to my life. And I could not tell if my vision was blurring from anger or from the sudden sting of humiliation. But my heart pounded so hard I could feel each beat against my ribs. I turned slightly, preparing to leave the room because flight felt safer than standing there waiting for her next line, and I took one step toward the hallway when a subtle ripple moved through the crowd, something like a collective shift of attention that made people glance over Erin's shoulder and whisper to each other because someone else had entered the ballroom behind her. She kept talking, unaware, still basking in the glow of her imaginary spotlight, and lifting her glass to make another joke at my expense. But the room had already changed its focus, sliding past her like a tide pulling away from the shore. And as I drew in a shaky breath and turned my head, I saw exactly why. He had arrived, just as the hook had predicted. Dylan stood directly behind her, and he had heard everything. For a moment, everything in the ballroom froze as if someone had pressed pause on the entire room, and Erin still held the microphone in her hand, smiling at the audience she believed she owned, oblivious to the way the air had shifted. And when Dylan finally spoke, his voice was calm in that unsettling way that silences a crowd more effectively than shouting ever could. And he said, "That is an interesting story, Erin. Mind if I correct a few numbers?" And the words slid through the space like a clean blade cutting through fog as every head turned toward him. Erin stiffened her shoulders slowly, as if she were trying to decide whether to laugh it off or play along her fingers, tightening around the microphone, while her eyes darted between the guests and Dylan, her smile twitching once before flattening, and she said lightly, "Oh, Dylan, hi, I was just telling them a fun little story." But the wobble in her tone gave her away. Dylan did not raise his voice. He did not even frown. He simply stepped forward with that steady gaze of his, the one that made people listen without needing to be asked. And he said, "When Jenna met me, I had 4 properties, and every single one of them had high vacancy rates and maintenance debt I could barely keep up with." And the room shifted again as murmurs moved through the audience, because that was not the fairy tale Erin had been selling. He continued, "After 3 years of her management, our vacancy dropped to 2, maybe 3% on a bad month, and our cash flow nearly doubled because she reorganized every repair schedule, every budget, every tenant process. And she did it quietly without bragging, and people looked at me with a kind of new recognition, as if the simple math of truth was rearranging the lines of the narrative Erin had spun." Dylan did not pause. He went on saying, "And when I wanted to hang on to a failing building because I was sentimental, Jenna was the one who told me to sell it and reinvest in something with real potential. And that decision is a big part of why our portfolio looks the way it does now, and that was the moment I saw a few faces in the crowd tilt their heads as if they were recalibrating everything they thought they knew." Then he reached the sentence that sliced through the humiliation Erin had spent years weaving, and he looked directly at the semicircle of listeners and said, "So if anyone here thinks she married into 6 million, you have it backwards. I married into the one person who knew how to turn our mess into 6 million." And the room let out a collective sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh, but something in between the sound of people realizing they had been watching the wrong person all night. Erin's face lost a shade of color, but Dylan was not finished because he had listened to every cruel thing she said, and he aimed the next truth like an arrow, not with malice but with clarity. And he said Jenna used her small 401k to save her parents' home from a tax lien years ago, and Erin never paid back even $1 of it. And this time, the reaction was sharper, because the crowd was older, full of people who understood mortgages, taxes, and sacrifice, and his words landed in a place that mattered to them. A man near the back cleared his throat loudly, as if the truth had knocked something loose. Someone else whispered that must have been thousands of dollars, and several people looked at Erin with eyes that no longer saw a funny, confident storyteller, but something smaller and meaner. And then a voice rose from the left side of the room, where a cluster of classmates had gathered a middle-aged man in a blazer, whom I vaguely recognized from algebra, and he said, "Wait, Jenna. Cole, you are on the board at North Shore Community Credit Union." "Right." And the entire room pivoted toward me with a new shock, because the name of that institution carried weight in our community. Anyone who needed a mortgage or a small business loan knew exactly how influential that board was. My pulse thudded in my ears as I answered softly, "Yes, I serve on the board," and the murmurs grew louder because suddenly the woman Erin had painted as helpless, awkward, or lucky had authority over something far larger than anyone in that ballroom had expected. Erin sputtered since when, as though she had a right to the answer, and I simply looked at her without speaking, because I owed her nothing. Not an explanation, not a timeline, not a justification for any part of my life. Dylan then stepped back half a stride, creating a small but deliberate space between himself and the microphone, before saying, "This is not my story, it is hers." And he extended the microphone to me in a gesture that felt both terrifying and liberating because it meant I could no longer hide in the shadows of the room or retreat into silence. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the microphone, not from fear of speaking, but from the weight of every instinct urging me to shrink the way I had shrunk my entire childhood and early adulthood. Yet something steadier pushed against that instinct, reminding me of the years I had survived, the money I had earned, the work I had done, and the voice I had long denied myself. When I finally brought the microphone to my lips, I did not raise my voice. I did not deliver a speech. I simply told the truth, piece by piece, beginning with how our college fund was supposed to be shared until it mysteriously disappeared into Aaron's tuition, and how I later learned that the promise to make it up to me had evaporated into thin air. I spoke about how I had quietly paid our parents' property taxes more times than I could count when they had fallen behind, and how I had loaned Aaron money in small amounts and large amounts, both of which she had dismissed as family generosity rather than debt. And I watched the audience absorb each sentence, not with the uncomfortable laughter Aaron's stories had produced, but with a stillness that signaled understanding. I did not name call or embellish or accuse. I stated the facts with the calmness of someone who had nothing left to prove, and somewhere in the middle of my words, Heather nodded slowly, a gesture that strengthened me more than any applause could have. By the time I lowered the microphone, the room felt different. No longer tense with the edge of public ridicule, but heavy with the awareness that people had been watching the wrong person perform all night. And in that heavy silence, a few hands began to clap quietly at first, from the corner where Heather stood then, from two others, and finally the applause spread in a small wavering circle of genuine recognition. Erin stood motionless, her expression brittle and cracked, like porcelain left too long in the cold, and though she still held the microphone, she did not lift it again because there was nothing left for her to spin, nothing left for her to twist, no joke that could reclaim the room she had just lost. In the weeks after the reunion, there was a stillness that felt almost foreign because Erin, who had always flooded every space with noise and commentary, simply disappeared from my phone and from the family group chat, as if silence could erase what had happened in that ballroom, and for a brief moment I wondered if she had finally realized the cost of her cruelty, or if she was just regrouping, waiting for the next stage where she could twist herself back into the victim. But the quiet did not last because gossip never stays contained in a town like Duluth, where people talk in checkout lines and exchange updates in parking lots. And it was not long before whispers drifted back to me about Mark having his hours cut at work, and about their credit cards climbing toward limits they could not pay, whispers about late notices piling up, and a mortgage that was sliding toward dangerous territory. I did not celebrate any of it because I did not take pleasure in other people falling apart, even when those people had done their best to dismantle me for years. But I would be lying if I said it did not feel like the universe finally pulling on threads that Erin herself had woven too tightly for too long. And one night, just as Dylan and I were finishing dinner, my phone began to buzz with an incoming call from her name. A name I had seen countless times before, with dread. But this time, I let it ring twice before answering because I could already sense what kind of conversation it would be. The moment I picked up, I heard her breathing hard, the kind of uneven breaths that come from crying or panicking, and she said, "Jenna, please, I need your help. The bank sent a warning about our mortgage. We have been late a few times, but this time they said it could move toward default if we do not catch up," and her words spilled out quickly, mixed with sobs that sounded more frantic than remorseful, and she added, "You are on the board. You can talk to someone. Get us a break, just 90 days so we can get things together." I closed my eyes because the request was so predictable, it felt almost scripted. The exact kind of lifeline she assumed she could pull whenever her choices backed her into a corner. And before I could respond, She added with a sharp tremor in her voice, "You owe me at least this after embarrassing me in front of everyone, which hit me with the force of a slap." Because it was such a twisted reversal of the truth that for a moment I could not even speak. When I finally answered, I kept my voice steady because anger would only feed her delusion. And I said, "Aaron, I have helped you more times than I can count. I covered your debts when we were teenagers. I paid our parents' taxes when you would not. And I let you stay on my phone plan for nearly 20 years without asking for anything in return." And she tried to interrupt, but I cut her off gently, saying, "The board does not interfere in personal mortgage cases. And even if it did, even if I had that kind of power, I would not use it, because for years I bent my own life to fix yours. And I am done being your emergency fund." There was a long, crackling silence on the line, followed by a choked sound that might have been a sob or a frustrated gasp, and she whispered, "So you are really going to do this to me?" And I replied quietly, "I am not doing anything to you. I am simply not shielding you from the consequences of your own decisions anymore." She hung up abruptly, and I let the quiet settle because there was nothing left to say and nothing left for me to rescue. The next morning, however, I decided to do something that would have made the old version of me cringe and the new version of me feel grounded. I copied a link from the credit union website for a class called Financial Basics for Families, a beginner-friendly course designed to help households budget, plan debt reduction, and understand mortgage responsibilities. And I sent it to Erin with a short message that said, "This is the best help I can offer now." Predictably, she responded within minutes, asking if I was mocking her, if I was trying to insult her intelligence, and claiming that she did not need a class. She needed real help. And as I read her message, I felt that familiar ache of exhaustion, but also a sense of clarity because it was the first time I had offered someone exactly what would help them instead of what would enable them. And even if she saw it as an insult, I knew it was a form of justice that most people her age desperately needed but rarely admitted. Over the next week, the fallout continued in small, petty ways because Erin began calling every contractor I had ever recommended to her the plumbers, the electricians, the heating repair guy. And because I had always told them to bill her at my discounted rate, they had always been generous with their schedules. But now that she no longer had my name attached to her requests, things changed, and one heater technician told her his calendar was booked for 2 weeks and that labor rates had increased, and she called me furiously demanding to know, since when is everyone suddenly so busy as though the problem was the world and not the fact that she no longer had access to the shortcuts that my reputation had earned? I listened but did not respond because silence was sometimes more powerful than any argument, and after a moment she hung up again, leaving only the brittle sound of her anger behind. Then came the final twist of the month, a twist that unfolded quietly, but hit harder than any confrontation, because during a board budget meeting at the credit union, our executive team reviewed a batch of mortgage refinance applications, and when the second page slid across the table toward me, I recognized the address instantly. Erin and Mark had applied for a refinance, likely hoping to consolidate their debts and lower their payment. But the report showed high delinquency, escalating credit usage, and insufficient income stability, so the automated system had already flagged it as declined. I felt a brief tightening in my throat, not out of pity, but out of the surreal awareness that her financial life had finally reached a place where even she could not pretend everything was fine. And as the discussion moved on, I sat quietly without saying a word to push her file forward, and without saying a word to stop it, either because the weight of justice is sometimes found in the simple act of stepping aside and letting cause and effect finally meet each other. When the meeting ended, I closed my folder and walked out into the crisp air, noticing that for the first time in years, I did not feel responsible for the path Erin was on. Not in guilt, not in fear, not in obligation, and it occurred to me that the truest form of revenge is not cruelty or manipulation, but the decision to no longer carry someone who is always expected to be carried. In that moment, I realized that I had not ruined her life. I had simply stopped protecting her from it. A few months passed quietly in that steady way life sometimes moves, when the chaos finally burns itself out and leaves only the smoke behind. And by early spring, word had already spread through Duluth that Aaron and Mark had listed their house, the big 2-story place with the remodeled kitchen she used to brag about at every holiday dinner. And when the sale closed, she posted a short caption that said something vague about simplifying life. But everyone who read it understood that the house payment had climbed beyond what they could manage, and all the little warning signs they ignored were finally demanding their due. So they moved into a small townhouse without granite counters, without the glossy white cabinets she once mocked me for not having, and though they were not bankrupt, their entire identity built on showmanship and comparison had taken a hard fall, one that forced Erin to stand on ground she used to think was beneath her. Meanwhile, my own life shifted into a different rhythm because Dylan and I were closing out the fiscal year and sitting at our kitchen table one Saturday morning, surrounded by spreadsheets and statements, as we reviewed everything we had built slowly and steadily since the day we met, and the numbers still surprised me. Because somehow we were managing more than 400 units across multiple neighborhoods and 2 aging strip malls that were finally performing after years of strategic repairs and tenant changes. And when we calculated the latest valuations, Dylan grinned and said we just cleared $6 million again, a little higher this time, which made me laugh because the number no longer felt like a crown or a shield the way Aaron had treated it. It felt like the natural result of hundreds of late nights, thousands of tenant calls, and countless decisions we had made together. I had small stakes in 3 buildings now, each producing a stable flow of cash each month, something that still made the 15-year-old version of me who was denied a scholarship letter feel deeply vindicated. But in daily life, we remained simple, still living in the same triplex, near the water, still driving the same sedan, still choosing quiet over show, because wealth meant safety, not spectacle. With the pressure eased, I wanted to do something meaningful with the part of myself that remembered what it felt like to be trapped without choices. So I started directing a slice of my investment returns into a program at the credit union called the First Home Fund, designed for divorced women over 40 who needed help assembling a down payment for their first home. And when the board approved the expansion of the program, I felt something inside me settle because I knew exactly what kind of woman would walk through those doors. Women who had carried families for decades, women who had been told to be grateful, women who had been shamed into supporting everyone but themselves, and helping even a handful of them step into ownership felt more satisfying than any revenge ever could. At home, things changed too. My mother was aging and moving more slowly, her pension barely covering her basics, so I set up a simple checking account for her with automatic payments for her electricity, her medications, and her insurance. But I never handed cash to Aaron again because cash had always disappeared in that house, vanishing into wants disguised as needs. And one afternoon while I was visiting my mother, she sat with her hands folded on her lap staring at the small TV and said quietly, "I did not see how much you were carrying. I thought Aaron needed more. Maybe I was wrong and her voice was not dramatic or seeking forgiveness. It was just a woman seeing something too late." And I replied, "We cannot change back then. We can only decide what happens now." And she nodded as if that small truth was enough. By early summer, I found myself standing at a community center, leading a workshop about financial basics for midlife women. An audience of about 30 seated in folding chairs, worn smooth by years of gatherings, and I told them only the pieces of my story that mattered, because this was not about humiliating anyone and not about airing old wounds. It was about reminding women that they were allowed to say no without guilt, that they were allowed to build something for themselves without apology, and that responsibility did not require self-destruction. So I told them how long it took me to understand that being the reliable one did not mean being the sacrifice. And heads nodded slowly, some eyes glossy, some shoulders straightening as if they were setting down invisible bags that had been carried for years. That night after the workshop, Dylan and I sat on the back porch overlooking Lake Superior. The sky washed in soft blue and silver, and he leaned back in his chair and asked gently, "Do you ever regret not stepping in to save their house?" And I watched the small ripples move across the lake and felt the truth rise without hesitation. I shook my head and said, for the first time in my life, the only person I'm rescuing is me. And somehow, that is saving more than any check I have ever written. And Dylan reached over and took my hand, and neither of us said anything else because nothing more needed to be said. The lake breathed quietly, and the air smelled like pine and cool stone. And I felt something I had not felt in decades, a calm that did not depend on anyone else, a freedom that came not from running away, but from finally standing still in my own life. If you have ever been the bank for your family, if you have ever been dismissed or belittled, even while holding everything together, does Jenna's journey remind you of your own? Feel free to share your thoughts or simply leave a heart so other women know they are not alone. And if you want more stories of justice, money, revenge, and quiet healing, remember to like and subscribe so I can keep telling these stories on the nights you need them most.